This is E&P Audio, a service of Editor and Publisher Magazine. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing.
Welcome back for the 5th episode of E&P Reports, the official podcast from the staff of Editor and Publisher Magazine. I'm your host, Bob Andelman. This week, our emphasis is on women in news publishing. Joining us for an interview is Arizona State University journalism professor Julia Wallace, co-author with ASU's Kristin Gilger of There's No Crying in Newsrooms, What Women Have Learned About What It Takes to Lead. The conversation, conducted by E&P managing editor Evelyn Mateos, delves into the struggles and successes of women in news media. But first, here's New Yang, editor-in-chief, with the week's news headlines. New?
Thanks, Bob. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation reported this week how media companies in the country rally for press freedom, highlighting the strict national security legislation, the intense government secrecy, and threat of criminal charges for journalists doing their job. Newspapers like the Australian and the Financial Review ran special covers on Monday morning, redacting the front pages, while TV broadcasters ran campaigns on air during Sunday primetime shows. According to the ABC, the Right to Know Coalition is behind the campaign, which is in response to the raids the Australian Federal Police conducted earlier this year at the home of a News Corp journalist and the ABC's Sydney headquarters. Here in the States, the New York Times published a story last week how students at the University of Michigan are stepping up to cover their city, Ann Arbor. For more than a decade, the Michigan Daily, the university's student newspaper, has been the only daily paper in town after Ann Arbor News stopped printing in 2009. The staff of 300 is among the many student journalists across the country filling in the news deserts after more than 2,000 newspapers have closed or merged. In California, freelance journalists are paying close attention to a new bill that could hinder how many stories they can write each year. As reported by CJR, California Assembly Bill 5 could end freelance journalism in the state. Governor Gavin Newsom signed the bill into law last month, which makes it harder for companies to classify workers as freelancers. The law has some exceptions, such as letting journalists freelance up to 35 assignments per news outlet each year. But for some journalists, it's a tough situation. Nathan Cambridge, a freelance sports writer in Los Angeles, told CJR, in an ideal world, the company would recognize the value of my content and think, rather than not being able to use this person anymore, I'll give him a job. But that's not the world we're in with newspapers. What's going to happen is, I'm going to hit 35, and they're going to start giving me assignments. Whatever happens with the bill, we'll be keeping an eye on it. Be sure to check out our website for the latest news headlines and news publishing, as well as the announcement of our 2019 EPI Award winners. The announcement will go live on our homepage at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today. So come back to see which digital websites were honored, and good luck to our finalists.
Thank you, New. Next up, E&P managing editor Evelyn Mateos talks to Julia Wallace, co-author with Kristin Gilger of There's No Crying in Newsrooms, What Women Have Learned About What It Takes to Lead. Evelyn.
Thanks for joining us for E&P Reports, Julia. Recently, Julia Wallace and Kristin Gilger, two Arizona State University journalism professors, released their book, There's No Crying in Newsrooms, What Women Have Learned About What It Takes to Lead, a book that looks at the achievements and challenges that women have faced in the news industry. Julia, how do you convince men that it's tougher for a woman than a man in the newsroom?
That's a really good question, because I think that goes to one of the big issues, right, is that for such a long time, women talked among themselves about this, and guess what? We didn't solve the problem, right? The only way to really solve the problem is if we involve men, right? And so the question is, how do you make a man an ally? And I think you want to start with those who are more inclined that way. It can get really frustrating if you start with the guys who are, clearly at the other end of the spectrum, but it's people who you walk out of a meeting and somebody says, wow, I noticed that you got interrupted a lot. You found an ally, right? And then how do you develop them and help them sort of learn and see how they can contribute? I think it's really a step-by-step process, for all of us. It's helping people to walk in someone else's shoes.
Right. And for those men that you've found that are kind of open to talking about this, have you found any similarities between them? Have they experienced anything themselves that kind of, made it tough for them in the newsroom at all?
I think it's more about how they view their own masculinity. And so I think it's people who, sometimes it's because of a sister, sometimes it's because of their mother, but it's sort of how you grew up and what your expectations are to be a man and be a woman, I think somewhat defines it. I frankly think that there's some generational issues as well. That one of the things we find at the Cronkite School is a lot of the male students we have are heavily engaged in this conversation and want to know how they can be allies. So it's great to be able to sort of have that as a starting point.
Great, yeah. And so now with a title like this, it implies that you've kind of had some rough experiences in the newsroom. Would you agree?
Sure, of course.
Right. Are there any that you kind of want to talk about now that kind of, served as an influence for the book?
So, it's interesting. I would say throughout my career, it's, what we now call microaggressions. I think back then, I'm not sure I knew what they were, sort of little ways that wear you down. And that's, I think, one of the challenges for women. For some women, it's a big moment, something really horrible that happens. But for most of us, I think it's more the sort of day-to-day, not being listened to, not being taken seriously, being talked over, being interrupted, sort of the offhand comment that's really inappropriate, that just sort of wears you down, where you think, why do I have to work so hard when the guy sitting next to me is only working half as hard and getting more accolades? I'll give you a couple small examples, but I think that's sort of the point, is they're not huge, and I think that's pretty typical. I applied for a job early in my career as an editor, and the guy who was doing the interview said, "Oh, well, you can't be an editor. You don't dress like one." And, not terrible, could have been much worse, but it was just one of those things where you're like, okay, I don't wear a suit and a tie. I get that. I can still be an editor.
Right.
I think that's probably the more real challenge that women face.
Yeah, and now that you mention it, the little things are almost worse because they happen so often and every day, versus if it's one big thing, it's like, okay, I can get over that or get past that. Well,
and you do, and it's, one of my management theories is that if things are really bad, you can it's easier to fix. If it's something really bad, you deal with it. It's just when it's one thing after another, it's really hard to work through.
So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. How did you get involved with this project? I know last time we spoke, it seemed like Kristin had kind of started this project and had reached out to you.
So Kristin and I worked together, 20 years ago. She was the managing editor at the newspaper in Salem, Oregon. I got hired to the top job as the editor. And so I moved out to Salem, and so the two of us were the top leaders in the newsroom. Our boss was a woman, the publisher, and we had a lot of women in key newsroom roles. And so we talked about women's leadership and how it was different and why it mattered back then. And back in in the late 90s, there were probably nowhere in the country had the kind of leadership team we had, and we were both dealing with little kids at the time too. So just sort of the combination made it very different. So we both go off, do different things, have our careers. I'm now at Arizona State, and when I got hired here, she's like, I have this idea for a book. I really want to do it. I can't do it myself. How about you? And so it's been great. I mean, it's really been fun working closely with her after so many years, and really was labor of love for both of us.
Yeah, definitely. And so as soon as you kind of hopped on board, was there an immediate, like, we need to get this across with this book, or was it kind of like a process and figuring it out and whatnot?
So we identified pretty early themes that we wanted to cover. And so each chapter has a theme for the most part. And in most chapters have like a lead character. So we knew, this was actually, we started this before Me Too, but we knew that everybody had a sexual harassment story, so we were going to need to do a chapter on that. We knew that everyone has a challenge balancing work and home, and we were going to need a chapter on that. We talked about the issue of, for women of color, that the challenges are even higher than for white women, and we needed to talk about that, because the numbers are not great for all women in leadership positions in media, but when you look at the numbers for women in color, they're horrible.
Right.
So we just I think we sort of had themes, and we sort of had a framework, and then it was sort of finding the right people to help tell these stories.
Gotcha. So what was the most difficult chapter to write, or to find, the correct people to help you, as you were saying?
That's a good question. I think the chapter, that was hard was the chapter on, we have a chapter that talks about how it makes a difference if you have women in leadership. And the reality is there aren't that many places to look. We ended up focusing on Mother Jones, where they had 2 women co-editors for many years. We talked about a paper in Sarasota where they'd had some women in leadership positions for some years. But interestingly enough, we had a lot of trouble finding a lot of places where you really could talk about, like what we had back in the 90s, where a strong female leadership team and what that looks like. So, I think we did a good job with that chapter, but I sure wish we would have had more examples. In other chapters, it's like we had too many good stories to even talk about.
Right.
We had, in sexual harassment, everybody had a story, and it's like, which ones are we actually going to include?
Right. Yeah. Well, what about the easiest chapter?
Oh, well, so the sexual harassment chapter was really easy because everybody had a story, and they were crazy stories. The balancing work and home was sort of the same. Everybody had a story. And the other chapter that we actually ended up not with a lead character on that was really interesting was the chapter about the leadership sort of style issue. That if you're a man, you can have a wide range of leadership styles. You can be tough, you can be soft. It sort of depends, and you can make it work. For women, if you're tough, you're a bitch. If you're too soft, you're sort of seen as a pushover. And so it was interesting talking to women about that issue. And some people, Christiana Polar just sort of owns it and says, people call me a bitch, and that's their problem.
I remember seeing that, yeah.
Yeah, right? Really interesting. But then others like Cynthia Hudson from CNN Español talks about how she really has to sort of moderate her behavior so people don't think she's like angry all the time.
Mm-hmm. So now I know the book has been out for a couple months. What are women telling you about their own experiences since it came out?
So, it's funny. I can't tell you how many times we are actually doing a tour right now, and we've talked to probably more than 1,000 people already.
Wow.
And, one of the things that's interesting is everybody has an amazing story, and we're like, gosh, we should have talked to you for the book. And so I think that's what's been really interesting about it is that, and not just women in journalism. We were at an event in Phoenix on Monday night, and this woman came up to us afterwards who's a lawyer and said, this is exactly the same. And then there was a woman who's a doctor standing there. She goes, yes, let me tell you my stories. And I think that, we obviously know newsrooms. And so we picked newsrooms because one, we sort of know it, and journalists are great storytellers, and we wanted to make this a narrative. And so it was great to sort of focus on journalism. But I think the thing we learned is that these lessons are totally universal.
Right, definitely. And that's really interesting to see. I'm sure, was that something that you didn't expect?
I don't think we understood the depth of it. I thought we would have thought there were more nuances that, they're similar, obviously. You can look at the numbers and know that it's similar, but that there would have been more differences between different professions. And I'm not sure that we, at least from talking to people we've talked to, we've heard a lot of differences.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So can we move into the title a little bit? Why go with no crying in newsrooms? Was there any connection to the baseball movie at all?
Yes, absolutely. So this is actually my co-author gets credit for this. So we we wrote the book. We actually, it took us about 2 years, but the bulk of the work was done in 6 months. And so we were like, powering through it. We did over 100 interviews. We're interviewing people. We're writing. Everything's great. We're pretty fast. So the book's done, and it's 2 days away from the deadline, and we do not have a title we like.
Wow.
And, the working title at that point was Pushy Broads, which somebody had suggested, and we really hated. And it was like, okay, great. We'll think of something better. And so we had a lot of titles that were actually worse than that. It was hard to believe. But so we're going round and round, and we'd had brainstorming sessions with friends. We'd, done, big, PowerPoints, trying to figure it out, how it would look, drawing different covers. And so finally, my co-author, Kristin, she and her daughter were at the hairdresser, and they spent like 2 hours at the hairdresser brainstorming ideas, and they still didn't have it. And as driving home, it hit her. She loves the movie. She loves the movie There's No Crying in Baseball. It's a Tom Hanks movie called League of Their Own, which tells the story of Hanks as a coach of an all-women's softball team during World War II, a baseball team. And there's this great scene where he starts, yelling, "There's no crying in baseball." And all of us have at some point in our lives said to someone, "There's no crying in newsrooms," and take somebody aside. And when we interviewed people, so many people had a story about it. I cried in the hallway. I went to the stairs. I didn't want to cry in the newsroom. That, in a newsroom, it's fine to kick trash cans. It's fine to, yell and scream. But somehow there's this whole thing about crying. And so we just thought we would go right at it.
Gotcha. And, that's pretty universal too. I remember crying at my part-time jobs in college. I was a server, and I remember doing that. So
I know, it's absolutely true, right? And in some places it's probably a little more. How was it as a server? Was it okay or no to cry?
I feel like emotions ran high in that industry. So I don't know. Sometimes. That's a good question. I hadn't thought about that before, but on a certain level, maybe like sometimes for girls, I would say, maybe not for guys,
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. That's true. Yeah, I think in newsrooms, though, it was definitely not the cultural norm.
Right. So what's next? Are you thinking about, you and Kristin thinking about doing another book where you were going to include all these stories of the women you've met along the way? Or
Actually, we had such a good time on this. We've talked about, could we write another book? I'm actually really interested in the issue of aging, maybe because we are, and it's something that actually came up in the book. Where I was actually not prepared for this, where several women in their 40s talked about their concerns about getting older, that they look around and they see men in their 60s and 70s still active and engaged in the media, landscape, but women, and, sort of what happens to women at some point. And so it sort of stuck with me, and we haven't really sort of figured out what we would do with that concept, but I do think if you think about how many people are sort of entering that aging age as baby boomers getting older, and what that looks like. It's interesting, but who knows? We may think of something else in the meantime.
Well, that would be super interesting. So I hope we get to see that in the future.
Great.
So is there a platform or a website where people can get in touch with you and Kristin if they wanted to share their own stories?
Absolutely. We have nocryinginnewsrooms.com is our website. And then we have a Facebook page that is No Crying Leading. And feel free to join us on either one of those.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Julia, for joining us on E&P Reports.
Great. Thank you. I enjoyed doing it.
Well, that wraps up this week's edition of E&P Reports, the official podcast of Editor and Publisher Magazine. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Please subscribe in YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, Luminary, or wherever you watch or listen to your favorite podcasts. And if you'd like to rate and review the show, go ahead, we can take it, and we'd appreciate it. This is your host, Bob Andelman, saying thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Please consider checking out my other podcast, Mr. Media Interviews, now in its, yes, it's true, 13th year. That's mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. Let's talk, edit, and publish again next week.
This is E&P Audio, a service of Editor and Publisher Magazine. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing.